I'm Biresh Banerjee. Welcome to DW News Asia. Glad you could join us. South Korea says a Japanese plan to release treated radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean is safe. It's a significant endorsement coming just days after the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, greenlighted the same plans, saying it would have negligible impact on the environment. That assessment followed a 2-year review by the IAEA of the water release plan.
The plan, as it has been proposed and devised, is in conformity with the agreed international standards. And its application, if the government decides to proceed with it, would have negligible impact on the environment, meaning the water, fish, and sediment. If the government decides to proceed with it, the IAEA will be permanently here, reviewing, monitoring, assessing this activity for decades to come.
And this entire activity is expected to take around another 3 to 4 decades. We're talking of more than 1.3 million tons of radioactive water that will be treated, diluted, and then released into the ocean. It's radioactive in the first place because it's been used to cool down a nuclear plant that saw meltdowns after a deadly tsunami struck in 2011. Here's more on the damage control carried out after the accident at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
Once again, it's a race against time to prevent disaster in Fukushima. Radioactive wastewater from the crippled nuclear plant is now stored on site in tanks, about 1,000 of them. They're expected to reach capacity in 2024. Japan's government says the tainted water must be removed to prevent accidental leaks and to eventually decommission the power station. The plant operator TEPCO plans to dilute and then release the water through an undersea tunnel into the Pacific Ocean, about 1 kilometer offshore. It's the solution to a disaster that struck 12 years ago. A massive earthquake and tsunami destroyed the plant's nuclear cooling systems, causing 3 reactors to melt. To cool them, the plant now produces around 100,000 liters of wastewater every day. Once released into the ocean, the water will still be slightly radioactive. But plant officials say it will be diluted to levels safer than international standards. Some scientists say the impact of low-dose exposure remains unknown. Others say the plan is safe, but call for outside monitoring. Public concern over the release across the region remains high. Japanese fishermen worry people will stop buying fish from the area and have confronted government officials.
The release of the treated water is still a matter of life and death. If it does get released, we would like you to take full responsibility for the future.
South Koreans have turned out in protest, and some have even started panic buying sea salt and other seafood ahead of the release. China, too, has criticized Japan's plan.
China urges Japan to face up to the concerns of the international community and the people at home. Dispose of the nuclear contaminated water in a science-based, safe and transparent manner and accept strict international supervision.
Japan says it has provided detailed and science-backed explanations to its neighbors. If all final inspections go well, the water release is expected sometime this summer.
But from the very start, the plan has faced opposition and skepticism. Here's an example. Now, these are comments by Tokyo-based Greenpeace campaigner Katsue Suzuki, as reported in the South China Morning Post in March this year. She said, and I quote, "The government has discounted the radiation risks and turned its back on the clear evidence that sufficient storage capacity is available on the nuclear site as well as in surrounding districts. rather than using the best available technology to minimize radiation hazards by storing and processing the water over the long term, they have opted for the cheapest option, dumping the water into the Pacific Ocean. And joining me now for more context is Jim Smith, Environmental Science Professor at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. Professor Smith, is it safe to release radioactive water into the ocean?
Yes, it may sound strange to say that, but yes, in this case it is. So this water has been treated. So this is wastewater that's come from the Fukushima site, and it's been circulating around the reactors, cooling them. It's also contaminated groundwater. And in that, there were lots of radioactive elements, but most of those have been stripped out. So they have a treatment system which takes out things like cesium and strontium, which we might remember from the time of the Chernobyl or Fukushima accident. So it takes out those radionuclides. But what it can't separate from the wastewater is a thing called tritium, tritiated water. So tritium is a form of hydrogen, and what happens is that the hydrogen, the normal hydrogen H2O in water, one gets replaced by a radioactive hydrogen tritium molecule. And because it's chemically identical to normal ordinary water, it's almost impossible, and certainly at this scale, impossible to separate from wastewater. So that is what's going into or planned to go into the Pacific Ocean.
But when it comes to tritium, it is not clear, is it, about the impact that it has, the long-term impact in the ocean when it comes to marine and fish life. And add to that, Greenpeace in 2020 was talking about carbon-14 as well, that has the, quote, potential to damage human DNA. I mean, are these concerns unfounded?
Yeah. Yes, they are. Yes. I mean, Greenpeace I've studied the Chernobyl accident for 30 years, and Greenpeace has got a history of misleading people about, I believe, about the risks of radiation in the environment. So the tritiated water, it's important to say two things. One is that this happens all over the world at nuclear sites all over the world. So, for example, the La Hague site in France emits about 450 times more tritium each year into the English Channel than this Fukushima release will emit into the Pacific Ocean. China and South Korea nuclear power stations emit about three times more than this release will be. So this is something that's been going on for decades, and we haven't found any significant environmental problems. Tritium, if you have to release a radionuclide into the ocean, then tritium is probably the one that you would choose to release, because in the form of tritiated water, it doesn't bioaccumulate. So some radionuclides, for example, radioactive cesium, you'll get about 100 times in the marine system, about 100 times more radioactivity in the fish than you will in the water. But tritium in the form of tritiated water doesn't bioaccumulate. So the fish activities will be very low. Now, the other thing about tritium is that it's very weakly radioactive. So the damage that radiation can do to DNA, and tritium can damage DNA, but it depends not only on how much is absorbed in the organism, but by how energetic that radioactive emission is. And tritium is really very weak. So you need a lot of it to do significant damage to DNA. For example, so the World Health Organization drinking water limit for tritium is 10,000 becquerels per liter. And this radioactive release from Fukushima will be about 7 times lower at 1,500 becquerels per liter. So in theory, you could drink the water that's being emitted.
But then how do you convince people that fish from the Pacific Ocean, where some 1.3 million tons, if I'm not wrong, of radioactive water containing tritium is going to be released, that fish is safe for consumption?
Well, yeah, of course, there are other things in the release, and not everything. For example, Greenpeace have talked about carbon-14. So what the Japanese have done is that they've worked out that the water's treated to such an extent that the other radionuclides, apart from the tritium, are at 40% of the Japanese limit for emission. And then after that, it's diluted 100 times. So the the wastewater will be less than 1% of the emission limits. And it's really, really very low levels. And this will be checked. So the International Atomic Energy Agency are there on site at Fukushima and say they're going to stay for 30 years, and they'll be checking the fish and the water and what's being released and so on, as will, I'm guessing, independent organizations. Anyone can go and check the fish.
Right. Earlier we played a comment from Kazue Suzuki. She's a campaigner with Greenpeace, and we've discussed a lot about Greenpeace. She's a campaigner with Greenpeace in Japan, who has said that there is sufficient storage available for the radioactive water, and instead of storing and processing it in Fukushima over the long term, the cheaper option of releasing it into the ocean has been chosen. I mean, is she right? Are there better, safer options of dealing with radioactive water?
I don't think so, and that's for a number of reasons. So the storage in the tanks, it could in theory go on, but that leads to other risks. So, for example, if there's another earthquake or tsunami, you could get a leak of the tanks, and that would be an uncontrolled discharge into the Pacific, which would be at concentrations 100 times higher than what's going to be released in a controlled manner over 30 years. The other thing is that we have to be kind of pragmatic about how we address environmental risks. I'm an environmentalist, and I really want Greenpeace and other organizations to be focusing on the more important issues of climate change, plastic pollution of the Pacific, sewage going into the Pacific, overfishing. These are the real impacts on the Pacific Ocean. And I think this concentration on the Fukushima water discharge it's a distraction, really. We should be focusing on the main environmental problems.
Right. We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for all that context, Professor Jim Smith.